Hey, so glad you got here. We were totally waiting for you, just about to listen to a story. Tonight, the scent of warm bread drifts across quiet fields, curling through cool morning mist before the first rooster has even decided whether waking everyone up is worth the effort. Somewhere beyond sleepy cottages, a lonely oven is already glowing, while flour dances through the air like tiny wandering spirits that clearly have no intention of helping anyone clean afterward. If you've ever imagined a peaceful medieval village where everyone somehow knows everyone else's business before breakfast, then you've come to exactly the right place. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, leave a comment telling everyone where you're listening from and what your local time is. It's always fascinating to imagine this little tale reaching listeners scattered across the world, each preparing for sleep beneath a different sky. Now settle in, get comfortable, and just relax. Today's tale starts like this. There was once a man named Edwin, the baker of WillowBrook. Long before the village, chimneys released their first ribbons of smoke into the pale dawn, Edwin was already awake. He rarely needed the church bell to tell him the hour. Years of habit had trained his body more faithfully than any rooster ever could. His mornings began in darkness, when the stars still shimmered faintly above the rooftops, and the world seemed to belong only to those with honest work waiting. He dressed without hurry, pulling on simple wool clothes that smelled faintly of flour. No matter how often they were brushed clean, it seemed impossible to escape. Flour found everything. It settled into sleeves, boots, eyebrows, and even inside pockets where absolutely nobody had invited it. Some villagers joked that if Edwin ever sneezed too hard, an entire loaf might appear. He secretly suspected they might not be entirely wrong. Outside, WillowBrook rested beneath a gentle blanket of mist. The village itself was modest, built beside a narrow stream that turned the old watermill day after day. Small cottages leaned comfortably against winding dirt paths, surrounded by gardens bursting with herbs, onions, beans, and stubborn chickens that believed every path belonged to them personally. Edwin carried a small lantern toward his bakery. The building was humble, but every stone carried familiar memories. His father had once opened the same heavy wooden door each morning. Before him, his grandfather had done exactly the same. Their footsteps had faded years ago, yet somehow Edwin still imagined hearing them whenever the hinges groaned softly. Inside, yesterday's warmth lingered in the thick stone walls. The first task never changed. He knelt before the great oven. Dry oak logs rested where he had stacked them the evening before, carefully arranging kindling beneath them. He struck flint against steel. Tiny sparks leaped eagerly into waiting straw before growing into gentle flames. Soon the fire crackled with quiet confidence. The oven slowly awakened. Edwin always liked this part. There was something comforting about watching cold stone become warm again. It reminded him that even the quietest mornings held the promise of life returning. While the fire strengthened, he uncovered sacks of flour stacked neatly along one wall. Grain from nearby fields had been milled only days before, leaving the flour pale, soft, and pleasantly fragrant. He poured generous scoops into a broad wooden trough. Then came water, then salt. Finally, the sourdough starter. His family had carefully kept alive for generations. No one truly knew how old it was anymore. His grandmother used to claim that a piece of it had survived 3 kings, 2 floods, and 1 goat that somehow managed to eat nearly half the bakery before being politely escorted outside. Edwin had never confirmed that story. The goat, unfortunately, could no longer be questioned. He smiled to himself as he mixed the ingredients. His hands worked almost without thought. Fold, press, turn, stretch, again. The dough slowly transformed beneath steady fingers, becoming smooth and elastic. There was a quiet rhythm to baking that many outsiders never noticed. It demanded patience more than strength. One could not command bread into existence. The dough obeyed only time, warmth, and care. Perhaps people were not so different. As the dough rested beneath linen cloths, Edwin stepped outside. The eastern horizon had begun to glow. Soft orange light spread across distant hills, touching dew-covered grass, until every blade seemed decorated with tiny jewels. A cool breeze carried the earthy scent of damp soil. Birdsong gradually replaced the silence. One by one, WillowBrook began to wake. A farmer crossed the lane carrying wooden buckets. Someone opened shutters nearby. A dog barked with enormous enthusiasm, despite having very little reason to do so. Life unfolded gently. Edwin appreciated that. He had visited larger towns before, where streets overflowed with merchants shouting over one another, and carts rattled endlessly across crowded marketplaces. They were exciting places, for perhaps 2 days. Then they became exhausting. WillowBrook possessed something rarer. It knew how to be quiet. Back inside, the dough had already begun to rise. It always fascinated Edwin. A simple mixture of grain and water somehow filled itself with countless tiny pockets of air, growing larger as though quietly breathing. Most villagers accepted it without much thought. Others whispered that unseen blessings lived inside good bread. Whether that was true or not hardly mattered. Fresh loaves certainly had a way of lifting spirits. An eccentric tale occasionally circulated among traveling millers, claiming that some bakers in distant valleys would whistle softly while kneading because they believed cheerful songs encouraged dough to rise more evenly. Whether the bread truly listened remained impossible to prove, but the tradition persisted for generations simply because it made long mornings more pleasant. Edwin himself preferred silence. Still, on especially peaceful mornings, he occasionally caught himself humming, very quietly, so quietly that even the bread probably struggled to hear. The oven now glowed with steady heat. He shaped the first loaves carefully, each movement practiced through thousands upon thousands of repetitions. Round village loaves, long hearth loaves, smaller, rolls for children. Everything found its proper place upon the peel before disappearing into the waiting oven. Then came the waiting once again. Baking always involved waiting. Patience had become Edwin's closest companion. He never considered himself remarkable. He wasn't a knight. He wasn't a wealthy merchant. He certainly wasn't one of those wandering storytellers who somehow managed to make every encounter with a muddy road sound like a grand adventure. His adventures mostly involved remembering not to burn breakfast. Yet every morning, before the sun climbed fully into the sky, people throughout WillowBrook depended upon him without saying so aloud. Bread would appear, as it always had. As they trusted, it always would. The first wonderful aroma drifted through the bakery. Warm, nutty, comforting. It escaped through open windows and wandered into the village like an old friend announcing that another ordinary day had begun exactly as it should. Edwin closed his eyes for a brief moment. The day ahead would bring conversations, familiar faces, laughter, worries, and countless little moments that no one would remember years later, though together they would quietly shape the life of WillowBrook. For now, however, there was only the gentle crackle of fire, the golden promise rising inside the oven, and the peaceful certainty that some of life's greatest comforts arrived not with trumpets or banners, but with the simple fragrance of freshly baked bread. The first batch of bread emerged just as the village finished, rubbing the sleep from its eyes. Edwin slid the wooden peel beneath each loaf with practiced ease, drawing them from the glowing oven one by one. Their crusts were rich golden brown, with tiny cracks that sang softly as cooler air touched them. It was one of his favorite sounds in the world. Some people admired the ring of church bells or the melody of birds at sunrise. Edwin found equal joy in the gentle whisper of fresh bread settling after the bake. He lined the loaves neatly upon broad wooden racks. Soon the bakery filled with an aroma that seemed capable of persuading nearly anyone to smile. Even people determined to remain grumpy, rarely succeeded for long once warm bread, entered the conversation. The door opened before Edwin had even arranged the last loaf, as expected. Old Martha stepped inside carrying a woven basket. She arrived so reliably every morning that Edwin occasionally wondered whether she secretly lived inside the flour sacks overnight. "You're late," she announced. Edwin blinked. "I believe I'm exactly on time." "So you are," Martha admitted with a nod. "I simply wanted to see if you were paying attention." That was how many conversations with Martha began. She enjoyed testing people far more than they enjoyed being tested. Edwin handed her 2 round loaves. "They look excellent." "They always look excellent. Confidence suits you." "I learn from my customers," she laughed. "Careful. Too much praise and I'll expect sweet rolls tomorrow." Edwin pretended to consider the request. "I suppose I could make them." "You absolutely could. But then half the village would ask for them every morning." "They certainly would. And then I'd never have another peaceful dawn." Martha smiled knowingly. "You were never going to have peaceful dawns anyway." She tucked the bread safely into her basket before heading back toward the village square. Within minutes, another customer appeared. Then, another. Before long, the little bakery buzzed with quiet life. Farmers arrived carrying baskets of eggs or bundles of herbs to barter. Children bounced through the doorway with copper coins clutched tightly in small hands, trying very hard to look responsible, despite being thoroughly distracted by the smell of warm rolls. One young boy stared so intensely at a loaf cooling upon the rack that Edwin feared he might accidentally hypnotize it. "You may look at it all you wish," Edwin said. The boy nodded solemnly. "I am." "I noticed. It smells faster than I can think." Edwin chuckled. "I've never heard anyone describe bread that way." The child shrugged. "It feels true." Perhaps it did. Children often explained ordinary things better than adults managed. Outside, WillowBrook slowly settled into its daily rhythm. The blacksmith's hammer rang steadily across the lane. Women chatted while drawing water from the village well. Geese wandered wherever they pleased, apparently convinced that organized traffic rules did not apply to them. Truthfully, they would have ignored such rules even if someone had invented them. One particularly stubborn goose stopped directly outside Edwin's doorway and refused to move. Customers politely stepped around it. The goose seemed pleased with itself. No one argued. Arguing with geese rarely improved anyone's morning. Between customers, Edwin swept flour from the floor. The effort was mostly symbolic. Fresh flour appeared almost immediately. He had once heard a traveler claim there were castles where every surface gleamed without a speck of dust. Edwin found that difficult to imagine. A bakery without flour seemed as unlikely as a pond without water. Soon Thomas the Cooper arrived. His shoulders carried the strength of years spent shaping wooden barrels, but today he looked unusually thoughtful. Edwin noticed immediately. You've got something on your mind. Thomas accepted a loaf. Do I? You've forgotten to complain about your knees. I have. That's how I knew. Thomas smiled faintly. My youngest daughter wants to learn reading. That's wonderful. It is. But there aren't many books nearby. Edwin leaned against the counter. I've always believed wanting to learn is rarer than having something to read. Thomas considered that. I suppose you're right. The village priest owns a few manuscripts. He does. Perhaps he'd let her study them. Thomas's face brightened. I'll ask. Sometimes people entered the bakery seeking bread. Sometimes they unknowingly came searching for someone willing to listen. Edwin never hurried those conversations. He understood that worries like dough often became lighter after enough patient handling. Late in the morning, the pace finally slowed. Sunlight streamed through the open doorway, painting warm shapes across the wooden floor. Edwin carried a stool outside and sat beside the entrance with a small heel of bread and a wedge of cheese. Nothing extravagant. Just enough for a quiet meal. From there, he watched WillowBrook breathe. A shepherd guided sheep along the road. Two elderly men debated whose vegetable garden had produced larger cabbages 20 years earlier. Neither possessed any evidence whatsoever. Both argued with magnificent confidence. History, Edwin reflected, became surprisingly flexible whenever vegetables were involved. Nearby, a group of children played at pretending to be wandering knights. Their wooden sticks served as swords. Their invisible dragons appeared remarkably cooperative. Each dragon waited patiently until a dramatic speech had been delivered before allowing itself to be defeated. Very considerate creatures. As Edwin finished eating, his eyes wandered toward the distant fields surrounding the village. Golden grain swayed gently beneath the breeze. Every loaf upon his shelves had begun there. It was easy to forget. Customers admired the finished bread, but behind every crust stood countless hands. Farmers sowed seed, families harvested grain, millers ground flour, woodcutters supplied fuel, carters hauled heavy sacks. His own work depended upon all of theirs. Bread looked simple. Its story never was. An old belief shared in several countryside villages claimed that the first loaf baked after a successful harvest should never be sliced with a knife. Instead, it was carefully broken by hand and shared among neighbors, symbolizing that prosperity grew stronger when divided rather than hoarded. Whether the custom truly brought good fortune was impossible to know, but it certainly encouraged generous tables and grateful hearts. Edwin liked that tradition. He wished more people remembered it. The afternoon brought another steady stream of familiar faces. Widows purchased small rolls. Laborers stopped by before returning to the fields. Traveling peddlers exchanged cheerful gossip gathered from neighboring villages. Each conversation lasted only moments. Yet together, they formed the heartbeat of WillowBrook. A village was more than cottages, more than roads, more than fences and fields. It was these countless tiny exchanges, a greeting, a joke, an offer of help, a loaf wrapped in cloth, a question asked with genuine concern. As the shadows slowly lengthened across the lane, Edwin realized he had nearly sold everything baked that morning. Only a handful of loaves remained cooling upon the shelves. Tomorrow, before sunrise, he would begin again. The same fire, the same flour, the same familiar rhythm, yet no 2 days were ever exactly alike. Every morning carried the possibility that someone new might step through his doorway, bringing with them a story no one in WillowBrook expected. Edwin could not have guessed how soon that quiet possibility would become reality. Near dusk, when the last light softened the rooftops and the road beyond WillowBrook turned the color of old honey, a stranger came to Edwin's bakery. He did not arrive loudly. No rattling cart, no barking dogs, no dramatic cloak flapping in the wind. Though honestly, some travelers seemed deeply disappointed whenever weather failed to assist their entrance. He simply appeared at the doorway, tall and lean, with dust upon his boots and a walking staff polished smooth by many miles. His cloak was plain, though well kept, and his beard held a few silver threads that caught the firelight when he stepped inside. Edwin looked up from stacking empty baskets. "Good evening." The stranger bowed his head. "Good evening, baker." His voice was calm, neither hurried nor tired, though his clothes suggested he had walked far. Edwin glanced at the shelves. "I'm afraid there isn't much left. A few barley loaves, one rye loaf, and some rolls that lost an argument with the morning." The stranger smiled slightly. "Bread that survived the day still has wisdom. That is one way to flatter leftovers. I would like the rye loaf." Edwin wrapped it in clean cloth and set it upon the counter. The stranger placed 2 coins down. "Too much." Edwin pushed one back. "That loaf costs less." "I know." "Then your coin has become confused." "Keep it." Edwin did not take it. People occasionally overpaid by accident, but this man's expression held no mistake. His eyes moved around the bakery with quiet interest, pausing on the oven, the flour sacks, the wooden trough, and finally on Edwin's hands. "You have worked dough since childhood," the stranger said. Edwin raised an eyebrow. "Most people notice the flour first. The flour is obvious. The hands tell more." That sounds like something said by a man who has spent too much time walking alone. Perhaps. The stranger accepted the returned coin at last, tucking it away without argument. Then, instead of leaving, he touched the wrapped loaf gently and asked a question Edwin did not expect. "Do you ever bake bread with fennel and dark honey?" For a moment, the bakery seemed to grow very still. Outside, the evening sounds continued. Distant laughter, a cartwheel squeaking, someone calling a goat by a name the goat clearly did not respect. But inside, Edwin felt an old memory stir. Fennel and dark honey. He had not heard those words together in years. "My mother used to mention such a bread," Edwin said carefully. "Did she make it?" "Not often." "Why not?" Edwin wiped his hands on his apron, though they were already clean enough. "She said it belonged to lean winters and long journeys, a keeping bread, dense, dark, sweet at the edge. My grandfather baked it when snow closed the roads." The stranger nodded, as though confirming something privately. "And do you know the recipe?" "Not properly." "Not properly is not the same as no." Edwin gave a quiet laugh. "You ask like a priest taking confession." "I have known priests. They usually ask longer questions and enjoy the sound of them more." That, Edwin had to admit, felt fair. He studied the man more closely. Travelers passed through WillowBrook from time to time, but few asked about forgotten family recipes. Fewer still knew which forgotten recipe to ask about. "Where did you hear of it?" The stranger rested both hands on his staff. "From a widow in Ashcombe years ago. She said the best fennel honey bread she ever tasted came from WillowBrook, from a baker with kind eyes and terrible singing." Edwin winced. "That would be my grandfather." "So he did sing." "Unfortunately for everyone nearby." The stranger's smile widened. "She said the bread kept her children fed during a winter when the river froze hard enough for oxen to cross." Edwin remembered the story vaguely. His grandfather had traded loaves for firewood, wool, and once, supposedly, a carved whistle shaped like a turnip. Why anyone carved a turnip-shaped whistle remained one of those mysteries best left undisturbed. The stranger looked toward the oven. "I hope to taste it before I leave this valley. I cannot bake it tonight." "I did not ask tonight." "No? I asked whether chance truly forgets old things, or whether old things wait until someone asks the right question." Edwin stared at him. "That is a heavy sentence for a man buying rye. I have carried heavier." The quiet humor between them faded slightly, though not unpleasantly. Edwin sensed no threat in the stranger, only purpose. A strange purpose. Yes, but then again, purpose often looked strange when it arrived dusty at supper time. "What is your name?" Edwin asked. "Rowan." "From where?" "Many places." "That is not a place. It is more honest than choosing one." Edwin accepted that. Some travelers belonged less to villages than to roads. Rowan lifted the wrapped rye loaf. "I will sleep near the old willow bend tonight. I leave at first light unless rain persuades me otherwise." "Rain rarely negotiates." "No, but it interrupts confidently." At the door, Rowan paused. "One more thing, Baker." Edwin waited. "If you ever find that recipe, bake it for those who remember hunger, not only those who can praise flavor." Then he stepped back into the evening. Edwin watched him cross the lane, his figure slowly blending with the blue-gray shadows. The village continued around him as if nothing unusual had happened. Martha argued with a neighbor near the well. A child chased a chicken with the seriousness of a royal messenger. Smoke lifted from chimneys. Somewhere, the blacksmith laughed loudly enough to frighten pigeons from a roof. Yet Edwin remained still. Fennel and dark honey. The words pulled at him. After closing the bakery, he lit a small lamp and climbed the narrow ladder to the loft above the workroom. It was mostly used for storage. Old baskets, cracked bowls, spare linen, and tools that had once seemed useful enough to keep, but not useful enough to find again. Everyone had such things. Even medieval bakers, apparently, were not immune to clutter. They simply called it practical inheritance and looked noble while tripping over it. Against the far wall sat a wooden chest that had belonged to his mother. Edwin knelt before it and lifted the lid. Inside lay folded cloth, a few winter garments, a broken spindle, and several bundles of parchment tied with faded string. He touched them gently. His mother had written little, but kept much. Notes from suppliers, measures for festival cakes, names of families owed bread during bad harvests, small records of kindnesses, too ordinary for official chronicles, which meant, naturally, that they were probably the most important records of all. As he searched, he found a scrap tucked inside an old linen pouch. The writing was not his mother's. It was his grandfather's hand, uneven and cramped. Edwin held the parchment closer to the lamp. Fennel bread for snow roads. His breath caught. Below the title were measurements, brief instructions, and a note in the margin. Add dark honey last, and do not hurry the second rest, unless you enjoy chewing regret. Edwin laughed softly. That sounded exactly like his grandfather. Outside, night gathered fully over WillowBrook. The stranger's question had opened a door. Edwin had not known, was still waiting. And somewhere in the quiet dark, the old recipe had returned. Edwin did not sleep much that night, not because he was frightened, exactly. A rediscovered recipe was hardly the sort of thing that lurked beneath beds or rattled shutters in the dark. Still, the little scrap of parchment seemed to glow inside his thoughts, long after the lamp was blown out. Fennel bread for snow roads. He lay beneath his wool blanket and listened to WillowBrook settle into silence. The wind moved softly around the eaves. Somewhere outside, an owl called once, then thought better of making a conversation of it. Edwin kept seeing his grandfather's handwriting, cramped and stubborn, marching across the parchment as if each word had been kneaded into place. Before dawn, he rose. The bakery felt different. The same stone oven waited in the corner. The same sacks of flour leaned against the wall. The same trough stood ready. Yet the room seemed to hold another presence now. Not ghostly, not dramatic, just remembered. Edwin lit the fire slowly. He placed the old recipe beside the work table and read it again. Rye flour, barley flour, a small portion of wheat if the year had been generous, crushed fennel seed, dark honey, salt, starter, water, warm enough to wake, not hot enough to scold. That line made Edwin smile. His grandfather had always spoken to ingredients as though they were sensitive neighbors. He began measuring carefully. The rye flour smelled deep and earthy, heavier than the pale wheat flour he used for village loaves. The barley gave a faint sweetness, like dry grass warmed by afternoon sun. When he crushed the fennel seeds beneath a stone, their fragrance rose sharp and green, a little like anise, a little like walking through a herb garden after rain. It was not a fashionable scent. It was older than fashion. Edwin mixed the flours together, added salt, then poured in the starter. The dough formed slowly, dense and sticky, resisting his hands with the quiet determination of an elderly mule. "Well," Edwin murmured, "you have opinions." The dough offered no apology. He added water little by little, then the dark honey. It slipped from the spoon in thick amber threads, catching the firelight, as though the morning had briefly turned liquid. His grandmother used to say dark honey carried the memory of late flowers and stubborn bees. Edwin had never known whether bees were truly stubborn, but given how often they flew directly toward people who preferred peace, it seemed believable. As he kneaded, memories arrived. His grandfather's huge hands pressing dough. His mother laughing while scraping honey from a jar. Winter evenings when bread baked slowly, while snow sealed the village paths. He remembered being small enough to stand on an overturned crate beside the work table, proudly helping by doing almost nothing useful. At one point, he had dropped an entire handful of fennel seeds onto the floor and declared it an offering to mice. His mother had not been impressed. The first rest took longer than ordinary dough. Edwin waited. He baked the regular morning loaves, while the old recipe sat beneath linen, rising at its own pace. Customers came and went. Martha purchased bread and immediately noticed the unfamiliar scent. "What are you hiding?" "Good morning to you as well." "That is not an answer." "It is an experiment." Martha narrowed her eyes. "Experiments lead to trouble. So does gossip, yet you practice daily." She looked pleased rather than offended. "What sort of experiment?" "An old family bread." "Ah." Her sharp expression softened. "Your grandfather's?" "Yes. He made a dark loaf once when I was a girl, sweet at the edge. Made you feel full before you had any right to." "That sounds like this one." "I thought no one remembered it." "Someone did." Martha tapped the counter with one finger. "Old things are rude that way. They wait until you are busy, then demand attention." After she left, Edwin returned to the dough. It had risen modestly, not with the eager puff of wheat bread, but with a slow, steady swelling. It seemed less interested in impressing anyone and more concerned with becoming itself properly. He shaped it into broad, low loaves. The parchment warned against making them tall. Dense bread, it explained, disliked ambition. That, Edwin decided, was a useful lesson for certain nobles. He placed the loaves near the oven's mouth for their second rest. The instruction was clear: do not hurry, so he did not. Instead, he cleaned bowls, swept the floor, stacked wood, and tried not to stare at the dough, every 12 breaths like an anxious parent. The bakery filled gradually with fennel's strange green warmth and the dark sweetness of honey. By midday, the loaves were ready. Edwin slid them into the oven. The baking took longer than usual. He sat nearby, listening to the fire, watching the oven mouth glow. Outside, village life continued in soft waves. A cart rolled past. Children shouted near the stream. Someone's pig escaped and caused a brief but spirited debate over whether pigs understood property boundaries. The pig, by all reports, did not. At last, Edwin drew the loaves out. They were dark brown, almost bronze, with firm crusts and a fragrance unlike anything he had baked in years. Sweet, earthy, herbal, and warm. He waited before cutting. The recipe insisted a hot loaf sliced too soon would punish impatience. Edwin suspected his grandfather had written that after learning the hard way. When the bread had cooled enough, he broke one loaf open by hand. Steam rose gently. The crumb was dense but tender, flecked with crushed fennel. He tasted a piece. For a moment, the bakery vanished. He was a boy again, standing near his mother, while winter pressed against the shutters. He heard his grandfather singing badly. He smelled wool drying by the fire. He felt the strange safety of being small in a world made steady by adults who seemed permanent. Then the memory passed. The bakery returned. Edwin swallowed carefully. It was not the finest bread he had ever made. It was better than that. It belonged to someone. That afternoon, he did not place the fennel honey loaves on the front shelf. Instead, he wrapped them in cloth and carried pieces to those who might remember. Martha received the first. She took one bite and sat down without being invited. "Oh," she whispered. No clever remark followed, which from Martha was practically a cathedral bell. He brought another portion to Thomas the cooper, whose own father had once traveled winter roads. Thomas chewed slowly, eyes lowered. "My mother spoke of this bread," he said. "She said it kept men walking when their boots froze stiff." Edwin carried pieces to two widows, the miller and the old shepherd, who claimed he could predict weather by listening to sheep sneeze. This eccentric method had never achieved much accuracy, but it had given the shepherd tremendous confidence, which was almost as useful and significantly louder. Everywhere the bread went, stories followed: a flood year, a hungry winter, a wedding delayed by snow, a child saved from fever with broth and tiny crumbs soaked soft. By evening, Edwin understood something he had not expected. The recipe was not merely instructions for flour and honey. It was a door through which forgotten voices returned, one quiet memory at a time. When he returned to the bakery, only one wrapped loaf remained. He set it aside near the window. Perhaps Rowan would pass again. Perhaps not. Either way, the old bread had found its way home. By the next morning, WillowBrook had already decided that Edwin was doing something important. No one had officially announced this, of course. Villages rarely needed official announcements. News simply moved from doorstep to well, from well to mill, from mill to field, growing slightly taller each time it changed hands, like a loaf left too close to ambition. By breakfast, Martha had told 3 people that Edwin had revived his grandfather's winter bread. By mid-morning, Thomas had mentioned it to the cooper's apprentice, who told the blacksmith, who told 2 farmers, who somehow concluded that Edwin was preparing a secret feast. By noon, a child asked Edwin whether he was baking bread for a king. "No," Edwin said. "A prince? No. A giant? Not unless the giant pays fairly." The child considered this with grave seriousness. Giants probably eat too much. That has always been my concern. The truth was simpler, though not smaller. The village harvest festival was approaching. Every autumn, after the grain had been cut and stored, WillowBrook gathered to give thanks for another year of work survived. It was not a grand noble affair with silk banners and polished goblets. It was better than that. It had rough music, uneven dancing, roasted vegetables, cider, games for children, blessings for the fields, and at least one old man complaining that festivals had been livelier when he was young, which was how everyone knew tradition had been properly honored. This year, however, the festival mattered more than usual. The spring had been wet. The summer had been uncertain. Some fields had grown well, while others had struggled. People smiled. Yes, but Edwin had heard the worry behind their voices when they came for bread. He had seen farmers weighing sacks of grain with careful eyes. He had noticed mothers asking for smaller loaves while pretending nothing had changed. A harvest festival could not fill every cellar, but it could remind people they were not facing the winter alone. That afternoon, Father Alden came to the bakery with his hands folded inside his sleeves. He was a thin, gentle man with a habit of blinking as though every thought surprised him slightly. "Edwin," he said, "the council met last night." "The village council?" "Yes." "I assume everyone survived." "Barely. There was an argument about benches." "Naturally. And another about whether geese should be permitted near the feast tables." "They should not." That was the majority view. "A wise counsel, then." Father Alden smiled. "We would like you to provide the bread for the harvest festival." Edwin looked toward the shelves, then back at the priest. "All of it?" "All of it. That is a large amount of bread." "It is. An alarming amount." "Possibly. How many mouths?" Father Alden named a number. Edwin closed his eyes briefly. Then he opened them again, hoping the number might have become smaller. It had not. "That includes travelers?" "And guests from Ashcombe, Green Hollow, and the mill hamlets." "Of course it does. And perhaps the Reeves household." "Perhaps?" "He has not answered." "So yes. Probably yes." Edwin leaned against the work table. The challenge unfolded in his mind. Flour, salt, starter, firewood, rising time, oven space, cooling racks, cloth wrappings, transport, storage, helpers, timing. Bread seemed simple only to people who did not have to make enough of it to feed half the countryside. Father Alden waited quietly. Edwin could have refused. No one would blame him entirely. Supplying a festival meant exhausting days and uncertain reward. The village could ask several households to bake smaller amounts instead. Yet Edwin thought of the old fennel honey bread and the memories it had awakened. He thought of Martha, sitting speechless, Thomas remembering his mother's voice, widows holding warm pieces in both hands. Bread could be more than food. Sometimes it gathered people around themselves. "I'll do it," Edwin said. Father Alden's face relaxed. "Thank you, but I'll need help." "You shall have it. And grain. We will speak to the miller. And firewood. The woodcutters can contribute. And someone must keep the children away from the cooling racks." Father Alden grew solemn. "That may require divine assistance." "Then pray enthusiastically." The preparations began that very evening. Word spread quickly, and by sunset, villagers arrived offering what they could. Some brought sacks of barley flour. Others promised bundles of kindling. A farmer offered honey from hives kept near the western meadow. Martha delivered 2 clean cloths and strict opinions, both folded neatly. Edwin made a list on parchment, Festival loaves, rye rounds, barley trenchers, small rolls for children, fennel, honey bread, if enough dark honey could be gathered. He hesitated before writing that last part, then set the quill down firmly. Yes, that bread belonged there. The next few days passed in a rhythm of preparation. Edwin rose earlier than usual and slept later than was sensible. His bakery became a place of measuring, planning, testing, and mild chaos. Bowls appeared everywhere. Flour dusted the rafters. At one point, he found a spoon tucked inside his boot and decided not to investigate too deeply. The apprentice from the mill, a nervous lad named Osric, delivered sacks of flour and asked whether bread could explode if handled incorrectly. "No," Edwin said. "Good. It can collapse, burn, harden, sour, stick, split, or embarrass you publicly." Osric stared. "But not explode? Not usually." Usually? Edwin let that sit for a moment, because small mischief was one of the few luxuries available to tired bakers. An eccentric festival custom also returned during preparations. In WillowBrook, the youngest child able to carry a roll without eating, it was allowed to place the first loaf upon the feast table. This sounded charming until everyone remembered that small children had complicated relationships with temptation. One year, the chosen child had arrived proudly, holding half a roll and wearing the other half on his chin. The village had accepted this as a blessing anyway. As festival day drew nearer, WillowBrook transformed. Garlands of dried herbs were tied to doorways. The green near the stream was cleared. Benches were repaired with varying degrees of skill. Musicians practiced tunes that began confidently and ended wherever they personally felt inspired to stop. Farmers brought apples, onions, carrots, cabbages, and beans. Women brewed spiced cider. Children collected bright leaves and argued over which were most beautiful, as though autumn itself awaited their judgment. Through it all, Edwin worked. Yet beneath the busyness, he felt something steady growing. Not pride exactly, not fear either. A kind of responsibility. Each loaf would carry the labor of many hands. The grain had been planted by neighbors, milled by neighbors, carried by neighbors, baked for neighbors. The festival bread would not be his alone. He was simply the one trusted to bring it through fire. On the final evening before the festival week began, Edwin stood outside the bakery and watched sunset spread over WillowBrook. The fields beyond the village glowed bronze. Smoke rose softly from cottage chimneys. Somewhere, someone laughed. Somewhere else, a goose objected to existence. Edwin breathed in the cooling air and felt the weight of the task ahead. The oven would burn almost constantly. The dough would rise in waves. His hands would ache. Something would undoubtedly go wrong, because any plan involving flour, weather, villagers, and geese had already invited trouble to supper. Still he smiled. Tomorrow, the true work would begin. And for the first time in many years, the harvest festival would taste not only of plenty, but of memory. The trouble began with clouds, not dramatic clouds at first. Nothing towering, black, or shaped like a warning from heaven. Just a low gray gathering over the western hills, soft-edged and quiet. The sort of sky that made old farmers pause in doorways and say nothing for long enough to worry everyone nearby. Edwin noticed it while carrying empty flour sacks to the mill. The grain fields beyond WillowBrook were nearly ready for the last cutting. Golden stalks bowed beneath their own weight, whispering together whenever the wind moved through them. A good harvest was close enough to smell, which naturally was when the weather decided to become involved. At the mill, Osric stood outside with both hands on his head. "That sky looks bad," he said. "It looks undecided. Undecided skies become bad skies." "That sounds like something your master told you." "He says many things." "Are they useful?" "Some are about turnips." "Then we take what wisdom we can." Inside the mill, the great wheel turned steadily, powered by the stream that ran beside WillowBrook. The millstones rumbled with their deep, patient grinding. Dust floated in pale shafts of light. Sacks of grain waited along the wall, each one tied carefully and marked with a farmer's name. Miller Garrow, broad-shouldered and permanently dusted white, frowned toward the open door. "If rain comes hard before the western fields are finished, we'll lose some grain." "How much?" "Enough to taste in winter." That was all he said. In WillowBrook, people rarely wasted words on worry. Worry was understood. By noon, the wind shifted. By afternoon, the first drops fell. At first, children cheered and ran beneath the rain with open mouths, because children often believe weather exists mainly for their entertainment. Then the rain thickened. The road darkened. Gutters overflowed. Chickens fled beneath carts. Even the geese looked offended, which was impressive given their usual enthusiasm for dampness. Edwin stood beneath the bakery awning and watched water rush along the lane. Festival preparations paused. Harvest work did not. Men and women gathered sickles, cloaks, carts, ropes, and every scrap of covering they could find. The western fields had to be cut before the stalks bent and spoiled. There was no noble speech, no ringing horn, no heroic banner whipping in the storm. Just villagers pulling up hoods and stepping into mud because bread began long before ovens. Edwin closed the bakery early. Then he went with them. He was no farmer, but he had hands, and hands were needed. Rain soaked through his sleeves within minutes. Mud clung to his boots like it had sworn loyalty. In the fields, people worked in lines, cutting grain quickly and tying sheaves while others loaded carts. The storm blurred everything beyond a few yards. Voices became shapes in the rain. "Stack them higher. Cover that wagon. Mind the ditch." Someone slipped and sat down hard in the mud, then raised one hand and announced, "I meant to do that." No one believed him, but several appreciated the effort. Edwin worked beside Thomas, Martha's nephews, and the shepherd's oldest son. The grain was heavy with water. Each bundle seemed determined to fall apart at the worst possible moment, because apparently even wheat possessed comic timing. Still they continued, hour after hour. The rain did not stop. At one point, Father Alden appeared carrying a bundle of ropes. His robe was soaked nearly to his knees. "You look miserable," Edwin called. "I am offering spiritual encouragement. You are carrying rope." Practical encouragement seemed wiser. Together they secured tarps over loaded wagons, old linen, patched sailcloth, spare thatching mats, and one suspiciously fine cloak, donated by a merchant who looked deeply regretful afterward, were tied across the grain. By evening, the western fields stood half-cut and ragged, but much had been saved. The carts rolled toward barns and sheds. At the bakery, Edwin returned shivering, exhausted, and muddy enough that he paused outside rather than insult his own floor. Rain dripped from his hair. His hands ached. His shoulders protested every movement. Inside, the fire had faded low. The festival list still waited on the table. For the first time, Edwin wondered whether he had promised too much. The grain supply would be smaller. The roads might become difficult. The flour could be delayed. The festival bread might not be what everyone hoped. He sat near the oven and let warmth creep back into his bones. There is an old field custom, half serious and half mischief, that when rain threatened harvest, villagers would place a crust of bread on the windowsill for the wandering wind, hoping it would eat and move along. Sensible people knew wind did not eat bread. Sensible people also sometimes left the crust anyway, because harvest time made philosophers of everyone and fools of most. Edwin almost laughed at the memory. Then he stood, found a small stale crust, and placed it on the windowsill. "Go bother Ashcombe," he told the wind. The wind gave no answer. Rude, but expected. The next morning, rain still fell, though more gently. Villagers moved slowly through the lanes, sore from labor. But the barns were not empty. The mill still had grain. The festival would shrink perhaps, but not vanish. Edwin adjusted his plans. Less wheat, more barley, smaller rolls, thicker trenchers, fennel honey bread, reserved for sharing, not abundance. He began mixing dough, while thunder muttered beyond the hills. Each batch rose slower in the damp air, as though the dough itself had become thoughtful. He warmed bowls near the oven, wrapped resting loaves in extra cloth, and coaxed each rise with patience rather than panic. People arrived throughout the day, not customers only, helpers. Martha came to slice dried apples. Thomas brought extra firewood, stacked neatly by the wall. Osric carried flour from the mill under oilcloth, looking very proud whenever he managed not to drop anything. Children gathered kindling, though two became distracted by a frog and had to be redirected from what they called important frog business. The bakery became crowded, damp, fragrant, and alive. Someone hummed, someone laughed, someone sneezed flour across a table and claimed it was a blessing. Edwin watched them all and felt his earlier worry loosen. Hope, he realized, did not always rise easily. Sometimes it needed warmth, sometimes it needed shelter, sometimes it needed many hands, all sticky with dough, refusing to let the storm decide everything. By dusk, the first adjusted festival loaves came from the oven. They were smaller than planned, darker too, but their crusts were firm, their centers soft, and their smell filled the rainy evening with impossible comfort. Outside, the storm still moved across WillowBrook. Inside, bread kept rising. The rain finally eased on the third morning. Not all at once. It simply seemed to grow tired of its own company. The heavy clouds drifted eastward, leaving behind a pale blue sky streaked with silver. Water still clung to every fence post, every blade of grass, and every spider's web stretched between hedges. The fields sparkled beneath the returning sunlight, though patches of flattened grain reminded everyone how close the harvest had come to misfortune. Edwin stepped outside the bakery carrying a basket of warm rolls. The air smelled wonderfully clean. Wet earth, fresh-cut straw, wood smoke, rising from cottages where breakfast had already begun. It was the sort of morning that made people breathe a little deeper without realizing why. He looked toward the mill. Miller Garrow was already waiting. The older man waved him over. "I've counted everything twice." Edwin crossed the lane. "And?" "We'll manage." Those two words carried more comfort than an entire sermon. "But," Garrow continued, "there is always a but. There isn't enough fine wheat flour for everything you've planned." Edwin nodded slowly. "I expected as much." The barley survived well. The rye? Enough. Wheat? Garrow sighed. Not enough for the festival loaves. Edwin rested his hands on the edge of a flour sack. "So we adapt." "We do." The miller scratched his beard thoughtfully. "There may be another way." Edwin waited. "A monastery lies 2 days east. I've heard of it. They often grow excellent wheat. They also guard it carefully. They trade. For the right price." Garrow smiled faintly. "You bake." I do. They appreciate good bread. Edwin understood immediately. You think they'd trade flour for loaves. I think monks grow tired of eating their own bread. That thought amused Edwin more than it probably should have. Even men devoted to quiet lives might occasionally wish someone else had kneaded the dough. By noon, the village council gathered beneath the great oak near the green. The discussion was brief. Traveling east carried risks. The roads would still be muddy. Streams might have swollen. Time was short, yet without more wheat, the festival tables would look noticeably smaller. Finally, Father Alden folded his hands. I believe we have our answer. Everyone looked toward Edwin. He sighed. I was hoping someone else might volunteer. Martha raised one eyebrow. You are. I noticed. Thomas grinned. You know bread. I do. You know flour. I hope so. You don't complain very much. I complain constantly. Quietly. That still counts. Laughter rippled through the group. The decision was made. Edwin would leave at dawn. He packed lightly, a small bundle of clothes, his grandfather's fennel, honey loaf, carefully wrapped, several ordinary loaves, a wheel of cheese, dried apples, a water skin, his mother's old knife, not for fighting, for cutting bread, rope, and occasionally apples that refused reasonable cooperation. Before sunrise, much of WillowBrook gathered to see him off. It felt entirely unnecessary. He was traveling 2 days, not sailing beyond the edge of the world. Still, villagers liked occasions. Martha handed him a small cloth pouch. More fennel seed. I already packed some. You may lose it. I probably won't. You may. Edwin accepted the pouch. Thank you. Thomas adjusted the straps on Edwin's pack. They're crooked. They were comfortable. They were crooked comfortably. Father Alden offered a blessing for safe roads. Osric handed over 2 fresh rolls for the first morning. I thought I baked these. You did. I appreciate the gift of my own bread. I knew you would. Children waved enthusiastically. One little girl presented Edwin with a feather. For luck. It belongs to a chicken. The chicken wasn't using it. A fair point. With that, Edwin set out. The road east wound gently through forests, beginning to wear autumn colors. Gold, copper, deep crimson. Leaves drifted lazily onto the muddy path. Sunlight filtered through branches, turning puddles into mirrors. The world seemed freshly washed. Walking alone felt different from working. At first, Edwin found himself counting tasks still waiting back home. Mix tomorrow's starter, check the firewood, repair the cooling rack, ask Garrow about... He stopped. None of those thoughts would shorten the road. Instead, he listened. Birds, wind, the distant rush of streams still swollen from rain, his own footsteps. By midday, he reached a small crossroads where an elderly woman sat beside a cart loaded with onions. She eyed him kindly. You look like a baker. Edwin blinked. Is it the flour? It's the way you keep checking your hands. He laughed. I suppose it is. She offered him an onion. For the road. I have bread. Now you'll have something to put with it. He traded one of his rolls. Both left satisfied. Simple exchanges often felt richer than complicated bargains. Later that afternoon, Edwin entered a village he had never visited, smaller than WillowBrook, quieter. Children paused their game to watch the stranger pass. An old carpenter nodded politely. A woman sweeping her doorway smiled. Travel, Edwin discovered, was oddly comforting. Every village had different faces, yet each possessed familiar rhythms: smoke curling upward, dogs sleeping where they absolutely should not, someone repairing something that had probably been repaired 3 times already. Human beings, he reflected, seemed remarkably committed to fixing the same objects forever. Toward evening, he reached a modest roadside chapel where travelers were welcome to spend the night. The caretaker, Brother Cian, greeted him warmly. "You've walked far. Far enough. And farther tomorrow? To the monastery." "Ah." The monk smiled knowingly. "They bake excellent oatcakes. I've heard I'm going to trade bread. You'll succeed. You sound confident. They've never refused good bread." That evening, the small common table welcomed 6 travelers, a shepherd, 2 merchants, a potter, a woman carrying dyed wool to market. Edwin shared slices of fennel honey bread. Conversation slowed immediately. The shepherd closed his eyes after one bite. "I haven't tasted anything like this. It is an old family recipe. It tastes," the shepherd searched for words, "like winter becoming less frightening." Edwin smiled quietly. Perhaps that described it better than any recipe ever could. An eccentric belief common among travelers claimed that sharing the first loaf of a journey guaranteed friendly roads ahead. Refusing to share supposedly invited sore feet, broken cartwheels, or conversations with particularly talkative tax collectors. While no one could prove the superstition, few people were eager to test the alternative. Edwin gladly shared another slice. The loaf grew smaller. The table grew warmer. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Brother Cian pointed east. "The monastery sits beyond the cedar ridge." "Thank you. And Baker?" "Yes. When monks begin complimenting your bread," he paused dramatically, "accept graciously." "Why?" "They rarely praise anything," Edwin laughed. "I shall consider that a challenge." With renewed steps, he continued along the winding road. Beyond the ridge waited unfamiliar faces, precious grain, and conversations he could never have imagined when he first lit his oven only days before. The journey had carried him farther than miles alone could measure, and before the sun set again, another unexpected chapter would begin. By late afternoon, Edwin reached the monastery beyond the cedar ridge. It stood on a low hill above narrow fields, built of pale stone, weathered by wind and prayer. A small orchard spread behind its walls, and beyond that, long strips of wheat glowed gold beneath the clearing sky. Edwin stopped at the gate and adjusted the pack on his shoulders. 2 days of walking had given him sore feet, a stiff back, and a sincere respect for people who claimed travel was romantic. Travel was mud with scenery. A lay brother opened the gate. "Business?" "Trade," Edwin said. "Flour, if you have it." The brother glanced at the wrapped loaves in Edwin's arms. "And you brought bread to a monastery?" "I was told monks sometimes tire of their own." The brother's mouth twitched. A dangerous truth. He led Edwin through a quiet courtyard where herbs dried in bundles beneath wooden beams. The place smelled of sage, damp stone, smoke, and apples stored for winter. Somewhere nearby, men sang in low voices, the chant flowing like water over smooth stones. Edwin was taken to Brother Anselm, the monastery's cellarer, a square-faced man whose eyebrows looked permanently prepared for disappointment. "You seek wheat flour," Brother Anselm said. "Yes. So does everyone after storms. I can trade bread. We bake bread." "So I have heard." Brother Anselm folded his arms. "This must be remarkable bread. It is honest bread. That is what people say when something is heavy." Edwin smiled despite himself. Sometimes heavy things are useful. He unwrapped one of the fennel honey loaves and placed it on the table. The cellarer looked unimpressed. Then he smelled it. His expression changed only slightly, but enough. Edwin broke the loaf by hand and offered a piece. Brother Anselm tasted it. Silence followed. Not polite silence, interested silence. At last, the monk nodded once. "This is not common." "No. Old recipe? My grandfather's. Fennel, dark honey, rye and barley, a little wheat. You have a good tongue. I have a suspicious one. That also helps." Brother Anselm took another small piece, pretending it was necessary for judgment. Edwin wisely said nothing. After a while, the monk called for 2 others. They tasted the bread. Then a third appeared. Then, somehow, a fourth, though no one had called him. Monasteries, Edwin realized, had their own version of village gossip. It simply moved more quietly and wore sandals. By sunset, an agreement had been made. The monks would trade 3 sacks of wheat flour and 1 smaller sack of fine ground meal, in exchange for loaves baked in WillowBrook after the festival, plus Edwin's promise to teach Brother Anselm the method. Not the family starter, not the exact private notes, but enough. Edwin agreed. He felt pleased, relieved, and only mildly alarmed by the weight he would need to bring home. Fortunately, the monastery had a mule. Unfortunately, the mule had a personality. Its name was Pilgrim, which suggested holiness, until one tried leading it anywhere it did not wish to go. Brother Anselm patted the creature's neck. "He is dependable." Pilgrim looked at Edwin and immediately stepped on his boot. "Yes," Edwin said carefully. "I can see his devotion." The next morning, Edwin began the return journey with Pilgrim carrying the flour sacks. The mule walked beautifully for about 27 steps. Then it stopped. Edwin tugged gently. Pilgrim stared at a bush. "It is a bush," Edwin explained. Pilgrim continued staring. "It will not negotiate." The mule flicked one ear. After several long minutes, Edwin discovered that Pilgrim could be persuaded forward with dried apple slices. This made the journey possible, though somewhat expensive in snacks. The first day passed slowly. The road had dried in places, but deep mud remained beneath shaded trees. Twice, Edwin had to guide Pilgrim around washed-out ruts. Once, he slipped and grabbed the mule's saddle to steady himself. Pilgrim looked deeply offended, as if Edwin had violated some ancient legal agreement. Near midday, they crossed paths with riders wearing the colors of Lord Cedric, the noble who held lands around WillowBrook. Edwin recognized the badge at once. A black stag on a red field. The lead rider, Sir Alaric, drew rein. "Well met." "Well met," Edwin replied. "What do you carry?" "Flour for WillowBrook's harvest festival." Sir Alaric looked over the sacks. "From the monastery?" "Yes." "The Lord will be pleased." Edwin did not like how he said it. "Will he?" "He has decided to attend the festival." "That is generous." "It is expected that proper bread be provided for his table." Edwin kept his expression calm. "There will be bread for all." Sir Alaric leaned slightly in the saddle. "Lord Cedric does not eat as all eat." There it was, a sentence, dressed in velvet, but walking like a boot. Edwin felt tiredness settle behind his ribs. Nobles had a way of arriving late to other people's labor and asking why the best portion was not already waiting on silver. "The festival bread belongs to the village," Edwin said. "The village belongs to Lord Cedric." The villagers might explain that differently. The rider's eyes narrowed. Careful, Edwin told himself. Courage was good. Stupidity wore similar boots. Sir Alaric smiled without warmth. "Prepare 12 fine wheat loaves for the Lord's table, white as possible, well risen, no coarse barley, no dark rye." Edwin thought of the storm, the rescued grain, the villagers working in rain, the smaller rolls planned for children, the old bread meant to be shared among those who remembered hunger. 12 loaves, he repeated, at minimum. I will prepare what is fair. What is required, Sir Alaric corrected. Pilgrim chose that moment to bray loudly. It was not elegant. It was also not subtle. For one blessed heartbeat, everyone stared at the mule. Edwin almost thanked it. Sir Alaric gathered his reins. Do not disappoint Lord Cedric. The riders moved on, hooves striking the road with wet thuds. Edwin stood still until they disappeared beyond the bend. Then he looked at Pilgrim. That was either perfect timing or terrible manners. The mule chewed something invisible, possibly both. He continued toward WillowBrook with unease walking beside him. An odd legal custom. In some manors allowed lords to claim the finest loaf from certain village ovens during feast days, supposedly as a sign of protection. In practice, of course, protection often looked suspiciously like someone powerful taking the nicest thing and calling it tradition. History has always had excellent posture when stealing politely. By evening, Edwin reached the roadside chapel again. Brother Cian listened as Edwin described the demand. Will you obey? I will bake bread for his table. That is not quite the same answer. No, the monk smiled faintly. You are thinking like a baker. I hope so. Then remember, a loaf can be shaped many ways. That thought stayed with Edwin the next day. By the time WillowBrook came into view, smoke curling from chimneys beneath the amber sky, he had made a decision. He would not insult Lord Cedric. He would not endanger the village. But neither would he let one man's appetite swallow what everyone had saved together. There would be 12 fine loaves, and somehow, without shouting or drawing steel, or behaving like a fool with a heroic death wish, Edwin would make sure the village understood exactly what kind of bread was being served. Edwin returned to WillowBrook just as evening bells began to ring. The village seemed to exhale when he appeared on the eastern road with Pilgrim and 3 precious sacks of wheat flour. Children ran ahead shouting news before Edwin had even crossed the bridge. He's back, with flour, and a mule. The mule looks angry. Pilgrim did look angry, though Edwin had begun to suspect that was simply its resting expression. Miller Garrow hurried from the mill, wiping his hands on his apron. You found wheat. I did. And trouble? Some. From the road? From Lord Cedric. Garrow's face darkened. Ah, the expensive sort of trouble. Together they unloaded the flour inside the mill, keeping the finest sacks separate. Edwin explained the demand from Sir Alaric, 12 white loaves for the Lord's table, finer than what the rest of the village would receive. Garrow spat into the dust outside the door, which was not elegant, but communicated clearly. The grain was saved by everyone. I know. The children carried kindling. I know. Martha stood in rain until her shawl looked like riverweed. I noticed. And he wants the best. He expects it. Garrow leaned against a beam. What will you do? Bake 12 fine loaves. The miller stared. Then Edwin smiled faintly. And make certain everyone knows why they are fine. Before Garrow could answer, a strange cracking sound came from below. Not loud, not dramatic, just a dull wooden groan beneath the mill floor. Both men froze. Pilgrim, still outside, brayed as if offering expert commentary. Garrow frowned. That plank again. Again? Old storage space below, half collapsed. I keep meaning to repair it. That sounds safe. It has been meaning to collapse for 20 years. Very patient timber. Another groan followed. This one longer. Edwin stepped back. The floorboard near the rear wall shifted downward, spilling a trickle of dust and chaff between the cracks. Garrow muttered something almost holy, but not quite. They fetched lanterns, rope, and a pry bar. Edwin expected to find rotten supports, damp stone, perhaps a family of mice with strong opinions about privacy. Instead, when they lifted the broken boards, a narrow cavity opened beneath the mill. Cool air rose from below, smelling of earth, old straw, and forgotten wood. Garrow held the lantern over the gap. "Well," Edwin crouched beside him, "that is not a storage pit." "No." Stone steps descended into darkness. The miller scratched his beard. "My grandfather said there used to be an older mill here before the flood changed the stream." "Did he mention stairs?" "He mentioned ale more often than architecture." They widened the opening carefully, then climbed down. The steps were slick with age, but solid. At the bottom lay a low chamber built of rough stone. Roots crept through cracks in the wall. Old barrels had collapsed into hoops and powder. Clay jars stood along one side, sealed with wax-hardened black by time. On the far wall, beneath layers of dust, someone had scratched marks into the stone. Edwin lifted the lantern closer. Names, not many, perhaps 20. Some were barely readable. Garrow brushed gently with his sleeve. "These are family marks. From millers? Farmers too." Edwin saw one name and felt his throat tighten. Aldred, his grandfather's name. Beside it was another, Elian, Baker, his great-grandfather. Below the names, a rough carving showed a sheaf of grain, an oven flame, and an open hand. The meaning was simple enough. Grain, bread, sharing. Garrow opened one of the clay jars carefully. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay small bundles of dried seed. "Old grain," he whispered. "Still good? Too old to eat, perhaps, but maybe not too old to remember." In another jar, Edwin found folded scraps of parchment, brittle but legible. They were records, not official records, with seals and fancy language. These were plain village notes. Amounts of grain stored, families needing extra bread, names of widows, sick laborers, children, years of flood, years of frost, years when the Lord's tithe had been taken anyway. Edwin read one line aloud. "Half the wheat held back beneath the mill, by agreement of field, flour, and oven." Garrow's eyes widened. They hid grain. For hunger years. Another note explained more. Generations ago, after a cruel winter and a greedy steward, the villagers of WillowBrook had created a secret store beneath the mill. Farmers contributed seed. The miller hid it. The baker used it only when hunger threatened. No one person owned it. Field, flour, and oven. Edwin looked again at the scratched carving. His family had been part of this. Not wealthy, not powerful, but trusted. A curious rural practice once existed in some villages where emergency grain was hidden in clay-lined pits under barns or mills, known only to a few households. Officially, it did not exist. Unofficially, it meant children survived when taxes, storms, or bad luck arrived wearing important boots. Garrow sat back on his heels. "My father never told me. Mine either. Maybe they thought the need had passed, or they feared telling too many." The lantern flame trembled. Above them, the mill wheel continued turning, its slow rhythm echoing faintly through the beams. Edwin thought of Lord Cedric's demand. 12 white loaves, fine wheat, no barley, no rye. He thought of the hidden chamber, the names, the old agreement. No one person owned the harvest. No lord's appetite was older than this promise. Garrow touched the carving with dusty fingers. What now? We repair the floor. Yes. We keep the records safe. Yes. And tomorrow, we bake the festival bread. With the fine wheat? With some. And the Lord's loaves? Edwin folded one parchment gently. We will make them beautiful. Garrow looked suspicious. How beautiful? Very. That sounds dangerous. Only if people dislike meaning. People often dislike meaning when it embarrasses them. Edwin smiled. Then we shall make it delicious first. They climbed from the chamber, carrying the old records and one clay jar of seed. Edwin did not yet know whether the ancient grain would ever sprout again. But he liked the thought that something hidden so long might still hold life. By lantern light, he and Garrow replaced the broken boards enough to cover the entrance. They agreed to tell only Father Alden, Martha, and Thomas, for now. Not because the secret belonged to them, but because secrets, like dough, needed careful handling before being shared. Outside, night had settled. WillowBrook's cottages glowed softly in the dark. Edwin carried the old parchment back to the bakery beneath his cloak. The road felt different beneath his feet. Every familiar stone seemed tied to older footsteps now. His grandfather had not simply baked bread. He had kept trust. And now that trust had found Edwin's hands. The morning before the harvest festival arrived with clear skies and crisp autumn air. For the first time in days, WillowBrook awoke without worrying about rain. The fields shimmered beneath a pale golden sunrise. The stream beside the mill sparkled cheerfully, and even the geese appeared slightly less argumentative. Only slightly. Edwin stood outside the bakery for a brief moment, breathing in the cool morning. Behind him, the oven had already begun warming, its familiar crackle sounding almost like an old friend clearing its throat before an important speech. Today would be the busiest day he had ever known. Inside, the bakery had transformed into a small kingdom of organized confusion. Large bowls rested upon every available surface. Fresh flour waited in carefully measured sacks. Bundles of herbs hung from beams. Firewood stood stacked higher than Edwin himself. Thomas had arrived before dawn to split extra logs. Martha was already directing people, despite nobody officially placing her in charge. Curiously, everyone obeyed anyway. Those cloths belong over there. They were over here yesterday. And yesterday was yesterday. No one argued. Experience had taught them that debating Martha before breakfast only delayed breakfast. Osric rushed through the doorway carrying another sack of barley flour. I didn't drop this one. I'm proud of you. I nearly did. I appreciate your honesty. I tripped over a goose. That part I believe immediately. The young apprentice looked offended. It was entirely the goose's fault. That part I also believe. Within the hour, the bakery filled with steady work. Edwin mixed dough while Thomas carried wood. Martha shaped rolls with surprising speed. Father Alden wrapped cooled loaves in clean linen. Even several older children helped carry baskets from one table to another, proudly performing jobs that made them feel wonderfully important. The rhythm reminded Edwin of an orchestra, not a polished royal orchestra, more the sort where everyone knew roughly which tune they intended to play and trusted enthusiasm to solve the remaining details. Surprisingly, it worked. The finest wheat flour became 12 beautiful white loaves. Each one rose perfectly, each crust browned evenly. Each loaf looked worthy of a noble's table. Edwin handled them with exactly the same care he gave every other loaf. Beside them rested dozens upon dozens of village loaves made from rye, barley, and the precious mixture of wheat they could spare. Then came the fennel honey bread. Only 6 broad loaves, Not enough for every household, enough to share. As the sweet herbal fragrance drifted through the bakery, conversation softened. Even Martha paused. "It smells like years ago," Edwin nodded quietly. "I know." By midday, villagers arrived carrying dishes for tomorrow's feast. Roasted onions, pickled beets, apples, cheeses, butter wrapped in cool cloth. Every offering seemed modest alone. Together, they promised abundance. Shortly after noon, another traveler stopped outside the bakery. Not Rowan, a younger man wearing a faded green cloak. His boots were worn nearly through, and dust covered his sleeves. He hesitated at the doorway. "May I buy some bread?" "Of course." Edwin selected a hearty rye loaf. The traveler counted his coins carefully, then stopped. "I'm short." "By much?" "A little." Edwin looked at the young man's face, tired, embarrassed, hungry. He wrapped the loaf anyway. "You may pay what you have." "I cannot ask that." "You didn't." The traveler accepted the bread slowly. "I've walked from Green Hollow. Long road. It became longer when my cartwheel broke." "That happens." "I repair musical instruments," Edwin smiled. "That sounds more peaceful than repairing cartwheels." "Usually." The traveler glanced toward the shelves. "You're preparing for a feast." "The harvest festival." "We heard about it." "We?" "Several travelers." He hesitated. "They say WillowBrook welcomes strangers." Edwin thought for only a heartbeat. "If you're still here tomorrow..." "Yes? There will be room at the tables." The young man's eyes brightened. "I would be grateful." "So would we." After he left, Martha watched Edwin from across the room. "You gave away part of your profit." "I did. You'll never become rich." "I suspected as much." She folded another cloth. "Good." Edwin laughed. "So you approve?" "I approve of villages where strangers leave speaking well of them." Late in the afternoon, Rowan returned. No one saw him approach. He simply appeared beside the bakery door with that same quiet expression he had worn days before. Edwin looked up from dusting flour off the work table. "You came back." "I said I might." "You did." "I see you found the recipe." "I did." "And more than the recipe." Edwin blinked. "What makes you say that?" Rowan looked around the busy bakery. "People are working differently. They're helping. They're remembering." Edwin studied him carefully. "You speak as though you expected this." "I hoped." Edwin handed him a slice of fresh fennel honey bread. Rowan tasted it thoughtfully. "This one is better. It had more patience." The baker did. For several quiet moments, they simply stood watching the bakery bustle around them. Finally, Edwin asked, "Who are you really?" Rowan smiled. "A traveler." "You've said that." "It remains true. You know too much about forgotten bread." "I know many forgotten things." He paused. "My father traveled these valleys collecting old customs before they disappeared. Stories, and recipes, and songs, and village promises." Edwin's attention sharpened. "Village promises." Rowan nodded slowly. "Every village hides something worth protecting." Edwin thought immediately of the chamber beneath the mill. He said nothing. Rowan seemed satisfied by the silence. "Good. Good. Some secrets become stronger when spoken carefully." An unusual custom among wandering scholars held that recipes deserved to be copied only after they had been tasted in the village where they belonged. They believed food without place became merely instructions, while food shared among its own people became history you could eat. Edwin rather liked that idea. As evening approached, Rowan prepared to leave once again. "This time you're truly going?" "Yes." "You won't stay for the festival?" "It belongs to you." He adjusted his walking staff. "You no longer need someone asking questions." Edwin felt unexpectedly grateful. "You started all this." "No." Rowan smiled gently. "I merely reminded you where to look." With that, he disappeared down the western road until the fading sunlight swallowed his figure. Edwin watched him go. Perhaps some travelers carried maps. Others carried memories. Both, in their own way, guided people home. As darkness settled over WillowBrook, the bakery finally grew quiet. Hundreds of loaves rested upon cooling racks. The 12 white loaves waited separately, beautiful and flawless. Nearby rested the darker village bread. Different, honest, made from grain, rescued together. Edwin looked from one group to the other. Tomorrow, everyone would gather. Neighbors, travelers, children, laborers, the Lord himself. Bread would be broken, stories would be shared. And before the day was over, more than one person would discover that the finest loaf upon a table was not always the most valuable one. Before dawn on festival day, Edwin discovered Osric asleep beside the flour sacks. The miller's apprentice had curled himself between 2 bags of barley flour, with his cloak tucked under his cheek, breathing softly while one hand still clutched a wooden measuring scoop. He looked less like a future miller and more like a very tired squirrel, guarding winter supplies. Edwin stood over him for a moment. "Osric." The boy did not move. "Osric." One eye opened. "I wasn't sleeping. You were negotiating with dreams. I was guarding the flower." "With your face?" Osric sat up quickly, leaving a pale streak of flour across one cheek. "I only meant to rest a moment. You worked hard yesterday. I should have helped longer." "You helped plenty." Osric looked down at the scoop in his hand. "I still make mistakes. That is how apprenticeships work. If beginners were already masters, masters would have far fewer chances to look smug." The boy laughed, though he still looked uncertain. He had been at the mill only a year. Thin, quick-footed, and anxious as a sparrow, Osric had spent most of his apprenticeship apologizing to sacks, doors, carts, animals, and occasionally empty rooms. Yet Edwin had watched him through the storm days. The lad had carried flour through rain, gathered kindling, hauled water, and stayed awake long after younger helpers had wandered home. Today, Edwin needed him, not as an errand boy, as someone trusted. He handed Osric a clean apron. "Put this on." The boy blinked. "For carrying?" "For baking." Osric stared as though Edwin had offered him a crown or possibly a live eel. "I don't know how." "You know more than you think. I dropped a sack yesterday. Only half." "That feels worse." "It was barley. Barley forgives slowly, but it forgives." Edwin guided him to the work table where the final batch of children's rolls waited beneath linen. Small hands would reach for these before the feast was half begun, and if they were not ready, the village would face consequences more terrifying than noble displeasure. Hungry children with festival excitement. "Shape them," Edwin said. Osric hesitated. "My hands are clumsy." "All hands are clumsy before they learn. What if they come out wrong? Then they will still be eaten by children who are famously forgiving when handed warm bread." Osric touched the dough gently, too gently. It barely changed shape. "That dough is not a sleeping kitten," Edwin said. "It needs direction." The boy pressed harder. The first roll came out, lopsided. The second looked like a small defeated turnip. The third showed promise, then collapsed sideways, perhaps from embarrassment. Osric groaned. They're awful. They are enthusiastic. They look like stones. Soft stones. That is not comforting. Edwin picked up one roll and reshaped it slowly. Watch. Fold inward. Turn. Tuck. Round beneath the palm. Again. Osric tried. Better. Again. Better still. Soon a row of small rolls formed across the board. Some were not quite even, but they looked cheerful enough. Edwin had always believed bread did not need to appear perfect to offer comfort. Perfection was for nobles, painted saints, and people who never had to clean flour out of their sleeves. Outside, WillowBrook stirred toward celebration. Musicians tuned strings near the green. Women carried baskets beneath cloth covers. Men dragged benches into place. Children had already begun running in circles for no reason, except that festival air apparently made legs independent from judgment. Inside the bakery, Osric shaped roll after roll, his shoulders lowered, his breathing steadied. "You're improving," Edwin said. "I am?" "Don't sound so surprised. It makes my teaching seem suspicious." Osric smiled. "My father says I notice mistakes faster than answers." "Many people do." "Do you?" "Every morning." "You?" Edwin slid a tray toward the oven. "Of course, bread teaches humility. Fire teaches it louder." That seemed to comfort the boy. While the rolls baked, Edwin showed him how to judge, crust by color, how to tap the bottom of a loaf and listen for the hollow note, how to move trays quickly without rushing. Osric watched with fierce attention. At one point, he pulled a tray from the oven himself, safely, cleanly, no panic, no dropped rolls, no heroic disaster. He set the tray down and stared at it. "I did it. You did. I didn't burn them. Also true. I didn't drop them." A triumph for both bread and floor. Osric laughed, bright and relieved. An eccentric belief among some bakers claimed that the first loaf successfully made by an apprentice should be marked with a thumbprint and given to someone elderly, because old wisdom and young effort belonged on the same table. Whether it improved the apprentice's skill was doubtful, but it usually made grandmothers cry, which medieval villagers considered a powerful result. Edwin remembered this and pressed Osric's thumb gently into one small roll before it cooled. "Choose someone for that one." Osric's face flushed. "My mother?" "A wise choice." By mid-morning, the bakery stood ready. The final rolls were wrapped. The festival loaves were sorted. The fennel honey bread had been sliced into thick pieces for sharing. The 12 white loaves for Lord Cedric waited under a fine cloth, beautiful enough to satisfy any eye trained to value softness and whiteness above all else. Thomas arrived with a cart. Martha entered behind him, looked around, and nodded once. From her, this was thunderous praise. "Well," she said, "nothing appears ruined." "Your joy overwhelms me," Edwin replied. "I am pacing myself." Osric helped load the cart. He lifted baskets carefully, checking each one before setting it down. Yesterday, he had moved like someone waiting for the world to scold him. Now he moved like someone who had been given a corner of the world to protect. Edwin noticed. So did Garrow when he arrived from the mill. The miller looked at the trays. "Osric shaped these?" "He did." Garrow picked up one roll and examined it. The boy held his breath. "It is round." Osric nodded nervously. "Mostly." "It is baked." "Yes." "It is not on the floor." "No." Garrow's mouth twitched. "Excellent work." Osric's face changed completely. It was not dramatic. No music swelled. No sunlight burst through clouds, but something inside the boy stood taller. A small confidence had taken root. Outside, the cart rolled toward the village green. Osric walked beside it with Edwin, carrying the marked roll wrapped separately for his mother. The morning smelled of apples, smoke, damp leaves, and fresh bread. Villagers began gathering from every lane. The feast was close now, very close. Yet Edwin found himself thinking less about Lord Cedric's arrival and more about the apprentice beside him. Bread had risen, so had the boy, and sometimes Edwin thought that was the better miracle. The village green had become a feast before anyone sat down. Long tables stretched beneath garlands of dried herbs and autumn leaves. Benches stood in careful rows, though several leaned in ways that suggested optimism was doing important structural work. Baskets of apples shone red and gold. Jugs of cider waited beneath cloth covers. Bowls of butter, cheese, onions, beans, and roasted roots crowded every surface. And then came the bread. When Edwin's cart rolled into the green, conversations turned toward it, like sunflowers toward morning. Children gathered first, naturally. Children could sense fresh rolls through walls, weather, and possibly sealed stone chambers. Are those for us? Some are. How many? Enough. Enough for two? Enough for one, first. This answer was received with diplomatic disappointment. The youngest child chosen to place the first loaf upon the feast table was little Beatrice, who carried her roll with intense seriousness. Halfway to the table she stopped, smelled it, and looked deeply tempted. Everyone held their breath. Martha leaned down. Beatrice, the child sighed like a tiny widow burdened by life. I know. She placed the whole roll on the table. The village cheered. A great victory for civilization. Music began soon after. 2 fiddles, a drum, and a pipe played together with cheerful uncertainty. The tune wandered, stumbled, recovered, and somehow became dancing. Villagers clapped while children spun until they fell laughing into the grass. Even Father Alden tapped one foot before noticing and pretending he had merely adjusted his shoe. Then Lord Cedric arrived. His horse was fine, his cloak finer, and his expression carefully arranged to suggest that everyone should feel honored by his presence. Sir Alaric rode beside him. Several servants followed. The festival quieted slightly. Edwin stepped forward and bowed. My lord. Baker. Lord Cedric glanced toward the tables. I trust my loaves are prepared. They are. Thomas brought forward the 12 white loaves under clean cloth. When Edwin uncovered them, they gleamed pale and perfect. A murmur passed through the villagers. Lord Cedric smiled. At least someone here understands quality. Edwin kept his face calm. Then he lifted one loaf. These were made from the finest wheat saved after the storm, he said clearly. Grain cut in rain by many hands, carried through mud, dried with care, milled before dawn, and spared from the village share to honor your table. Silence. A very interesting silence. Lord Cedric's smile stiffened. Every villager now knew exactly what those loaves contained. Not just flour, sacrifice. Sir Alaric shifted in his saddle. Edwin continued gently. The rest of the bread is darker, my lord, made with barley, rye, and what wheat remained. It is humbler, but it carries the same harvest. Martha's eyes shone with wicked approval. Lord Cedric looked from Edwin to the villagers, then to the white loaves. He was not a foolish man. Proud, certainly. Used to obedience, absolutely. But not foolish enough to appear greedy in front of an entire village on festival day. After a long pause, he said, Then the finest wheat has been well honored. He turned to his steward. Place 6 loaves at my table. Share the other 6 among the villagers. A breath moved through the green. Then someone clapped. Then everyone clapped. Lord Cedric accepted the applause as though generosity had been his idea from the beginning, which, to be fair, nobles often did with impressive speed. The feast began. Bread passed from hand to hand. The white loaves were sliced thin, so many could taste them. The darker village loaves were torn into generous pieces. Fennel honey. Bread was shared among elders. First, then travelers, then families who remembered lean winters through stories, if not through their own hunger. The young instrument maker from Green Hollow played a repaired lute after eating 3 rolls and looking as though life had personally apologized to him. Osric gave his thumb-marked roll to his mother. She held it carefully, kissed his forehead, and cried just enough to embarrass him thoroughly. A harvest feast. Custom in some villages involved hiding 1 bean inside a loaf. Whoever found it became king of the table until sunset. WillowBrook tried this once, but the winner was a goat that had stolen the loaf, so the tradition was politely abandoned for reasons of governance. As evening deepened, torches were lit. The music softened. People leaned closer over the tables, full and warm and grateful. Edwin sat at last near the edge of the green, hands aching, shoulders heavy, heart quiet. Martha lowered herself beside him. You handled the Lord well. I nearly swallowed my tongue. Good, it stayed where useful. Thomas joined them with cider. The bread was enough. Edwin looked around. Children slept against parents. Travelers laughed with farmers. Lord Cedric's servants ate beside villagers, perhaps more comfortably than their master expected. Yes, Edwin said, it was enough. Across the green, Lord Cedric tasted the fennel honey bread. His eyebrows lifted. For once, he said nothing. That, Edwin decided, was praise enough. The moon rose over WillowBrook, round and pale above the fields that had survived storm and fear. The tables were messy now, scattered with crumbs, apple cores, spilled cider, and all the ordinary evidence of people having been happy together. And when the final song drifted into the cool autumn night, Edwin understood that the feast had not solved every worry. Winter would still come. Cellars would still need care. Work would still begin before sunrise. But tonight, WillowBrook had remembered itself. Field, flower, oven, open hand, and warm bread passed from one person to another beneath the watching stars. The morning after the harvest feast began more quietly than any morning Edwin could remember. WillowBrook seemed determined to sleep just a little longer. The musicians had finally stopped playing well after moonrise. Children who had raced through the festival now slept so deeply that several parents quietly wondered whether they might remain that peaceful forever. Even the geese appeared unusually thoughtful, though that illusion lasted only until one of them chased a farmer carrying cabbages. Some things, Edwin reflected, restored the proper order of the world. He opened the bakery as always. Fire, flour, water, starter. The familiar rhythm returned, comforting precisely because it asked nothing extraordinary of him. Festival days were rare. Ordinary mornings built lives. Customers drifted in later than usual, each carrying stories from the celebration. Thomas insisted the young musician from Green Hollow had played 6 different dances. It was 4, Martha corrected. It felt like 6. You danced like it was 12. I have enthusiastic feet. You have confused feet. Thomas accepted this judgment with surprising dignity. Father Alden arrived carrying an empty basket. I believe the village consumed every crumb. I noticed. I found two children arguing over the last crust. Who won? The dog. Edwin laughed. An impartial conclusion. The bakery filled with easy conversation. People smiled more readily. Even worries about winter seemed softer after a shared feast. Then, just before midday, the smell reached Edwin. Not bread, smoke. Different smoke. Thicker, sharper. His head turned immediately toward the rear of the bakery. Outside, someone shouted, "Fire!" Edwin dropped the loaf he had been wrapping and ran. Behind the bakery stood his woodshed, stacked high with seasoned oak prepared for the coming months. A thin stream of gray smoke curled from beneath the roof. Then came another crack. A spark burst through the weathered shingles. The dry wood inside had caught. "Buckets!" Thomas shouted from the lane. Villagers reacted before fear could settle. Women hurried toward the well. Children formed a line, carrying smaller pails. The blacksmith arrived with heavy hooks. Father Alden organized people without raising his voice. Martha somehow appeared already carrying 2 full buckets. No one paused to ask how. The flames spread quickly. Dry timber burned eagerly after weeks spent drying beside the bakery wall. Edwin and Thomas forced open the shed door. Heat rolled outward. The stacked wood inside glowed orange beneath climbing flames. "We can't save all of it," Thomas called. "We save what we can." Together they dragged unburned logs away from the doorway, while others threw water onto nearby fences and the bakery wall itself. The greatest danger was not losing the shed. It was losing the oven. Stone resisted fire well. The wooden roof did not. Smoke thickened. Ash drifted through the air like dark snow. One beam collapsed inside the shed with a shower of sparks. Everyone stepped back. The structure groaned. Then, with remarkable decisiveness, the roof folded inward. The fire roared once, then slowly began to consume itself. For nearly an hour, the villagers worked, bucket after bucket, shovel after shovel, until finally, only hissing embers remained. Silence settled over the yard. Edwin stood breathing hard, his face streaked with soot. The woodshed was gone. Half the winter, firewood with it. He looked toward the bakery. The walls still stood. The oven remained untouched. The roof had survived. His knees suddenly felt very tired. Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder. "You still have your bakery." "I do. And your eyebrows." Edwin touched his face instinctively. "They're important. They certainly improve recognition." Despite everything, Edwin laughed. A little shakily, but genuinely. No one ever discovered exactly how the fire had begun. Some believed a hidden coal from the previous evening had remained alive beneath discarded ash. Others blamed a carelessly dropped ember carried by the wind. One elderly villager confidently blamed untrustworthy sparks, which explained absolutely nothing while sounding wonderfully authoritative. By afternoon, people began returning, not as customers, as neighbors. The woodcutters arrived first. Without ceremony, they unloaded fresh logs beside the ruined shed. We had extra. Edwin knew they had not. Next came farmers with bundles of kindling. The cooper delivered spare barrels. The blacksmith repaired bent iron hooks without accepting payment. Women brought cooked meals, insisting Edwin should not waste time preparing supper. Even the children contributed. One little boy solemnly carried 3 perfectly dry sticks. "They're good ones." Edwin accepted them with complete seriousness. "They certainly are." The boy beamed. An old countryside belief claimed that after a house fire, neighbors should each bring one piece of wood to the rebuilding. ensuring no family ever had to rekindle warmth alone. Whether the custom began from necessity or kindness hardly mattered. Over generations, the two had become impossible to separate. Before sunset, the empty space behind the bakery no longer looked empty. It looked hopeful. The next morning, rebuilding began. Thomas measured new posts. The carpenter cut beams. Osric volunteered to carry tools, nails, rope, boards, and occasionally the wrong item with tremendous enthusiasm. "I'm getting better," he announced after delivering exactly the hammer requested. "You are." "I only brought the shovel by accident once." "That is progress." "I remembered halfway." "Excellent." By midday, Rowan unexpectedly returned. He stood quietly at the edge of the work, watching villagers raise the first frame of the new woodshed. "You've been busy," he observed. Edwin smiled. "The shed disagreed with fire." "I can see that. You chose an interesting day to visit." "I often do." Rowan watched as Martha directed 3 men, twice her size, into lifting a beam, precisely where she wanted it. "They're rebuilding quickly. They refuse to let me do it alone." "Does that surprise you?" Edwin looked around. At Thomas tightening ropes. At Osric balancing carefully along a timber. At Father Alden holding one end of a measuring line. At children collecting stray nails into little baskets. "No," he admitted softly. "It doesn't." Rowan nodded. "Good." He reached into his satchel and produced a small linen bundle. "For the new beginning." Inside lay several packets of unusual herb seeds. "Kitchen herbs," Rowan explained. "And these? Bee balm. I don't know it. It brings bees. And bees bring honey." "They do." Edwin looked at the tiny seeds resting in his palm. Such small things, yet they carried seasons inside them. Before leaving once more, Rowan helped raise the final roof beam. He worked without ceremony, said little, accepted no praise, and shouldered his walking staff as evening approached. "You never stay long," Edwin remarked. "Travelers rarely should." "You'll return?" "Perhaps," he smiled. "But even if I don't." His eyes moved across the rebuilt frame, the gathered villagers, the bakery standing safely behind them. "I think WillowBrook remembers enough now." Edwin watched him disappear down the western road once again. This time, he did not feel as though something were leaving. Instead, it felt as though something had firmly taken root. Behind him, neighbors laughed while fitting the final boards into place. The woodshed was not yet finished. Neither, Edwin supposed, was any life worth living. But with enough hands, enough patience, and enough shared bread, almost anything could be rebuilt. The new woodshed rose slowly over the following days, as all good things in WillowBrook tended to do. Not slowly in a frustrating way, slowly in the way that allowed conversations to happen while work was being done and mistakes to be corrected before they became traditions. By the 3rd morning, the frame stood strong and square. By the 5th, the roof beams were in place. By the 7th, the first stacks of firewood began to return, carried in by villagers who now seemed oddly protective of Edwin's ability to keep his oven warm. Even Osric treated each log like it contained a fragile secret. "I checked this one twice," he said proudly. "Against what?" "Against being wrong. That is not a standard measurement." "It should be." Edwin did not argue. Standards, he had learned, were flexible things in WillowBrook. Bread was not. Bread demanded attention. Inside the bakery, life returned to its familiar rhythm, though now with a quieter confidence beneath it. The festival had passed. The fire had been survived. The harvest had been saved. Even the Lord's visit, with all its quiet tension, now felt less like a threat and more like a memory that had been properly put away. But something had changed. People lingered longer when they came for bread, not because they needed more, because they wanted to stay near the warmth a little longer. Martha noticed it first. "They talk more now," she said one morning. They always talked. They talked before like they were passing through each other. Now they talk like they are standing still together. Edwin considered that. "Is that bad?" "No," she said quickly. "It's just noticeable." She paused, then added, "It's your fault. I'll accept responsibility for warm conversations." "Good. I would have blamed you anyway." Thomas began repairing old baskets for neighbors without being asked. Father Alden started leaving extra candles at doorways in the evening. Even Lord Cedric's steward, who briefly returned to inspect proper storage of festival goods, left without making any demands after receiving a loaf of barley bread and apparently reconsidering his life choices. Winter approached slowly, as it always did, not as a sudden arrival, but as a gradual reminder in the air. The fields outside WillowBrook turned pale and still. The stream narrowed. Birds gathered in larger groups, arguing over invisible matters only they understood. One morning, Edwin found Osric standing outside the bakery before sunrise. "You're early," Edwin said. "I couldn't sleep." "Trouble?" "No," the boy hesitated. "I was thinking about next year's harvest. That is ambitious. I want to help more. You already do. I want to do it properly." Edwin leaned against the doorway. "Properly is not something you reach once and keep. It changes every time you try." Osric nodded slowly. "That sounds exhausting." "It is. But good?" "Yes." The boy smiled faintly. "I like it here." "That is dangerous." "Why?" "Villages notice when people like them. They start asking them to stay." Osric glanced at the bakery. "I wouldn't mind." Edwin did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the boy's hands, still flour-dusted, still uncertain in places, but no longer afraid of uncertainty itself. "We'll see," Edwin said at last, which in WillowBrook often meant yes, but with patience attached. That afternoon, Father Alden arrived with a sealed parchment. "The Lord Steward has sent a request," Edwin groaned softly. "Not another 12 loaves. No. Worse? Different." Edwin opened the parchment. It was written formally, carefully, and with the kind of polite distance that suggested many drafts had been burned before this version survived. "Lord Cedric requests that the baker of WillowBrook supply bread for his winter holdings. Fair payment will be given." Edwin read it twice, then a third time. "This is a contract." "Yes," Father Alden said, "a real one." "It appears so." Martha leaned over his shoulder. "Well?" Edwin folded the parchment slowly. "He wants bread through winter." "And?" "That is a lot of bread," Thomas chuckled. "You've faced worse." "I've faced wetter," Edwin corrected. "And you survived both." Edwin looked toward the oven, then toward the shelves, then toward the doorway, where cold air had begun to settle more firmly each evening. "If we accept," he said slowly, "it will mean more grain planting, more firewood, more help from the village." "Or," Martha added, "it means stability." "That too." Osric spoke quietly. "Does it change the festival bread?" Edwin shook his head. "No." "Does it change WillowBrook bread?" "No." "Then it sounds like more work," the boy said. "Not less life." Edwin smiled. "That is an excellent way to put it." He looked again at the contract. Lord Cedric had arrived once as an expectation. Now he returned as an arrangement. That was progress, in its own strange way. But Edwin thought of Rowan then, of hidden grain, of promises beneath mills, of bread belonging to places, not just people. "This will need agreement," he said. "With whom?" Thomas asked. "With WillowBrook." That evening the villagers gathered in the bakery, not in alarm, not in urgency, simply because that had become their habit when something important needed deciding. Edwin read the contract aloud. When he finished, silence followed, then discussion, then disagreement, then agreement again. Finally, Martha spoke. "If we do this, we do it together." Thomas nodded. "So no one carries it alone." Osric raised his hand. "I can carry flour." Everyone looked at him. He added quickly, "I mean, part of it." Edwin folded the parchment. "We accept," he said, "if it is shared work, and if the village always comes first." No one objected. Not even the idea of Lord Cedric, who had become less a man and more a distant requirement of paperwork. That night, Edwin sat alone by the oven after everyone left. The fire crackled softly. He thought of how quickly things had changed. A stranger asking about forgotten bread, a storm, a fire, a hidden chamber beneath a mill, a festival, a contract, and all of it tied together by something very simple: people, feeding people. He reached into a small cloth pouch and found a few fennel seeds Rowan had given him earlier. They felt small between his fingers, almost nothing, and yet they had once brought warmth through winters that refused kindness. Edwin smiled to himself. "All right," he murmured. "Let's see what winter teaches us next." The oven answered with a steady glow, as if it already knew. Winter arrived in WillowBrook the way it always did, quietly at first, then all at once. One morning, frost simply decided it belonged everywhere, on rooftops, on fence posts, on the edges of empty barrels, even on Osric's eyebrows, which he discovered after stepping outside and immediately declaring winter personally invasive. The bakery became the center of steady warmth. Fire was no longer preparation. It was survival. Edwin rose earlier than the sun and kept the oven alive through long hours of kneading, shaping, and baking. The contract with Lord Cedric had transformed the bakery into something larger than before, but not heavier in the way he feared. Instead, it had become structured, predictable, shared. Each week, carts left WillowBrook carrying bread, not just for the village, but for the Lord's holdings beyond it. In return, grain arrived in measured, reliable amounts. Firewood followed. So did occasional messages from the steward, each more polite than the last, as though even distant authority had begun to learn something from warm bread. The villagers adapted quickly. Thomas organized deliveries. Martha managed storage with quiet precision. Osric learned to calculate dough batches without moving his lips, which Edwin considered a remarkable sign of progress and possibly mild obsession. Even Pilgrim the mule, now temporarily employed for hauling flour, became slightly less hostile, though only toward Osric, for reasons no one fully understood. One cold morning, Father Alden visited with news. "The Lord Steward says the winter stores are holding well." "That sounds like praise," Edwin said. "It is dangerously close to it." Martha nodded. "Careful. If we receive too much praise, they may expect us to behave." No one wished for that. Despite the cold, life continued with a steady rhythm. Bread, fire, work, rest, and in between. Small moments that never made official records, but somehow carried the weight of everything important. A child leaving a warm roll on a neighbor's doorstep. A farmer repairing a broken hinge without being asked. Osric finally remembering to tie flour sacks before lifting them, and not dropping them, twice in a row, which in WillowBrook terms was practically mastery. One afternoon, as snow began falling in soft, quiet sheets, Rowan returned again. No announcement, no sound beyond the crunch of footsteps outside the bakery door. Edwin looked up from shaping dough. "You're late," he said. "I am exactly on time," Rowan replied. "That is what you always say." It remains accurate. Snow dusted his cloak. His staff looked older than before, or perhaps simply more traveled. "You came back for winter," Edwin said. "I came back because winter arrived." "That feels like avoiding the question," Rowan smiled. "It often does." He stepped inside and warmed his hands near the oven. The bakery smelled of rye, barley, fennel, and honey, still faintly lingering from past batches. It smelled, Edwin realized, like everything that had mattered in the last year. "You've changed, WillowBrook," Rowan said. "We baked bread," Edwin replied. "Those are not always different things." Edwin studied him. "You knew the mill. I knew of it. You knew the grain store. I knew it existed. You knew the recipe before I found it." Rowan did not deny it. "I knew pieces." "Why not tell me directly?" Rowan looked into the oven fire. "Because some things are not meant to be given, only rediscovered." "That sounds like a traveler's excuse." "It is also a baker's truth." Edwin considered that. Outside, snow thickened, softening the world beyond the glass. "Will you stay this time?" Edwin asked. Rowan shook his head. "I don't stay where things are settled." "WillowBrook isn't settled," Rowan smiled faintly. "WillowBrook is becoming itself." That seemed to satisfy him. He reached into his satchel and placed something on the table. A small wooden token, carved simply, a grain sheaf, an oven flame, an open hand, the same symbols from the mill chamber. "This belonged to the first agreement," Rowan said. "You're returning it?" "I'm completing it." Edwin turned the token over in his hands. "What does it mean now?" Rowan looked around the bakery, at the oven, the sacks, the tools, the flour dust in the air, the quiet strength of a place that had learned to share its warmth. "It means," he said slowly, "that nothing in WillowBrook stands alone anymore." A long silence followed, not uncomfortable, just full. Then Rowan adjusted his cloak. "I should go." "To where?" "Somewhere that still thinks it is separate." "That sounds like most places." "Exactly." He paused at the door. "One more thing, Baker." "Yes?" "Bread tastes better when it remembers what it survived." Edwin nodded. "I think we learned that." Rowan stepped into the snow and was gone. The bakery remained warm behind him. That evening, Edwin stood outside with Osric watching the snow fall over WillowBrook. The village glowed softly with hearthlight. Smoke curled upward in slow ribbons. The world felt smaller in winter, but not less alive. "Do you think he'll come back?" Osric asked. "Rowan?" "Yes. Eventually." "Why?" Edwin watched the falling snow. "Because people who carry questions don't really stop walking." Osric considered that. "That sounds tiring." "It is." They stood quietly for a while. Then Osric spoke again. "Edwin?" "Yes?" "Do you think I'll be good enough to run a bakery one day?" Edwin didn't answer immediately. He looked at the boy, at the steady hands, at the flour on his sleeves, at the confidence that had slowly replaced fear. "You already are," Edwin said. "You just haven't done it long enough to believe it yet." Osric smiled. "That still sounds like work." "It is." The wind moved gently through WillowBrook. Warm light flickered in every window. And inside the bakery, the oven continued to burn steadily, as it always would. field, flower, fire, bread, not as separate things, but as one continuous act of care passed from hand to hand, season to season, person to person. Edwin turned back toward the warm glow inside. "Come on," he said. "The Tao won't wait." Osric followed, and behind them, WillowBrook settled deeper into winter, not as something endured, but as something shared.